Well, good evening. If you don't know me, I'm Hendrik Spruit, the director of the Buffett Center for International and Comparative Studies. I'm very pleased to see such a great turnout, particularly given the weather and given, I guess, second midterms already. So thank you for coming tonight. Just a few quick words before I turn it over to our speaker. First of all, of course, it's my pleasure and indeed an honor to welcome Safak Pavey to Northwestern University. Let me go through my crib sheet because she's done so much. It's difficult to remember, so I want to make sure I get as much out as possible as I can. Ms. Pavey's background embraces diplomacy, journalism, filmmaking, and humanitarian work, so clearly a very diverse portfolio, which is impressive in its own right. She studied at the London School of Economics, specializing in nationalism and minority rights issues, and she also holds a degree in arts and media studies. In 1996, she had a train accident in Zurich, and lost her left arm and left leg. During her treatment, she developed a friendship with Zainab Kamen, and we're very pleased to have Zainab with us as well. Having both friends in the same room to address us today is a great honor, and of course, Mrs. Kamen has been a generous benefactor of the Buffett Center, so thank you for both being here tonight. Since her accident, Ms. Pavey has been active in disability rights issues. She has worked for the United Nations since 2003, and was until recently Public Affairs Officer for the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. She has been on humanitarian missions to countries in the Middle East and Southwest Asia. And in 2010, she became the first secretary to the new UN Convention on the Right of Persons with Disabilities. Since the election of July of this year, she's been the deputy of Istanbul and a member in the Turkish parliament for the CHP, the Republican People's Party, which is the second largest party in the parliament today. She has published 3 books, including one with Nobel laureate Shirin Ebadi. And if you remember, Shirin Ebadi addressed us earlier this year, so it fits very well that we have Safak Pavey today with us. So in short order, you've come to listen to her, not me. So please join me in welcoming her to Northwestern University. Safak, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very much pampering introduction, and I was actually the lonely one there. I was just talking just then that usually when you're a speaker, nobody sits next to you. And in all my photos, wherever I spoke so far, I'm always lonely in my photographs of the event. So hopefully after the event, I will also have some more photos in the crowd. And so yes, if I do not make sense in the following speech that I will be undertaking, please blame it on my jet lag, which has visited me today, this afternoon, actually. So, participating in politics in the Middle East as a disabled woman, which will include some of my own experiences as well as some observations in the region through my work there. Did you know that it's almost impossible to roll a manual wheelchair on the desert, and especially when you're wearing an abaya that covers all your body, and you have to keep it on your head straight, and you just cannot move a wheelchair. Well, I did discover this back in 1997 when I was a full-time wheelchair user then. And I did not have the flexibility of my prosthetic leg and arm. And it was by then the Libyan leader, Gaddafi, had decided to visit several African countries and end the whole visit in Chad by a Friday prayer to make an appeal to them as an Islamic call. And it was an international journalistic visit, and I was involved in it. With my wheelchair, and I was the only one. So they were trying everything to accommodate me in this big group of international journalists, but I did, of course, feel very much like the other. That was the start of that feeling in my life. Later on in my different duty stations in Middle East, I felt that over and over and over again. As a disabled woman, I discovered through my observations and looking for other peers that were not there, that a disabled woman did not necessarily have any place in the public life, leave it aside participating in politics. So that was my first discovery of it. And while then Libyan leaders, protocol people, tried to accommodate me, they have assigned the other person, the only other female person in the whole group in their delegation, who was a cabinet member. So she was there to see my needs. She was very high-ranking cabinet member. And through our otherness, we really connected. She was not disabled, but she was woman, and that was on its own enough. So to be the other in that whole group. And she was there to see my needs. At some point, I remember when we were ending the whole trip of a week, traveling with the then Libyan leader, Gaddafi, ending it with the Friday prayer in Chad. We have actually went there, landed, and suddenly the desert reality showed up before us. And we all discovered suddenly, because that was the first time, that it's not possible to use a manual wheelchair. It doesn't roll on the desert, although we tried every kind of way. And then the protocol people had ordered Chadian citizens, 4 of them, to carry me in my wheelchair on their shoulders. So just imagine the exclusiveness of that way of travel. I felt like Cleopatra at some stage, but with a great embarrassment. I mean, of being very exclusive and even more other than I felt. So, but through this journey, as I said, I was assigned this female cabinet member, the only female member of the delegation, official delegation. And we started chatting with her. And she said, slowly she started opening up, and she said, actually, I'm not a politician, I am an artist. But I was offered this position. I was told by the Libyan leader at the time, that you are appointed to this position, and I didn't know what to say. Because if I said, yes, great, enthusiastically, then it would mean, as a woman, it's not appropriate, first of all, that you're enthusiastic about a political position. But secondly, it would mean that I had deep down political ambitions in me. And although I couldn't say no either, because if I said no, it would mean an insult. I am actually there as a woman to accept what is given to me. So therefore, she took that position, wanting or unwantingly, and she has become a cabinet member. That is how her political career started. I don't know what she's doing right now, but she was a lovely lady, and I do hope that she did survive her whole turmoil. But in any case, I just wanted to share this with you as a little illustration before we go into deeper the Arab Spring or Autumn and women's participation in politics in the Middle East. So, links with poverty and development is something that we come across with the lack of women's participation in politics in the Middle East. Usually we come across with comments and analysts making this link. It is because of poverty and underdevelopment. However, World Bank reports of 2010 doesn't show us this. It rather says the contrary, all these statistics. For instance, Mozambique comes 200th country as one of the poorest countries with $900 national income per capita. Whereas in the ranking of women and men equality listing, it comes as a success story in the top 10 countries. And then we look at Qatar in the same list. Qatar is one of the richest countries. It comes 3rd in the national income per capita with $122,000 per head. But then when we look at the ranking of woman-man equality, equal opportunities, and women's empowerment in economy and participation in public life, then Qatar comes as one of the last countries. So therefore, perhaps we really need to look at the impact of culture here as well, more than poverty and underdevelopment factor. That makes me question. Speaking of Qatar, I have another woman portrait here that I got to meet, this great woman who comes from a privileged background and who made it out of all the barriers in her culture to an internationally high-level think tank-ish political platform as a member of it, with the support of her state. And her privileged ranks and being connected with the royal family did help her. So she was selected there out of thousands of other nationalities and candidates. She made it there, but somehow she wasn't being able to attend to all the meetings that was being held in different cities, different countries from at different times. And as we got closer in different meetings, I asked her. I couldn't just stand because she was great, and it was lovely having her in every meeting because she participated really great. And these were all closed meetings, in a way, think tank. And I said, you know, why don't you come to some meetings and why you come to some other meetings? And she said, first of all, it is my husband. Without my husband, I cannot travel out of the country. And it has to fit his schedule first, and I have to get his permission first to be able to travel, get my tickets, and design my life around his. So each time she came for a meeting, her husband actually had to come as well with her for her to be able to take a flight out of Qatar as a married woman. And second, she was, from time to time, she felt actually pressurized by the other male peers from her region who was part of that think tank platform. And she explicitly shared with me that at certain sensitive points in discussions, she was taken to a corner by them and told by these male members of the region, other participants in these discussions, that if she didn't, you know, she wasn't on their side on this issue, then she would get her punishment. And she was scared. So she would just fly out of that meeting and make an excuse, an emergency call, something, and she would just not attend that meeting. So this is the level of participation we're talking about. It is not an easy journey for a woman in Middle East, whether from Qatar or whether from Libya. These are different illustrations. So impact of culture we were talking about. We can, again, look at statistics. And when it comes to the economic participation and equality of women, those states with Islamic cultures are amongst the last. And that includes my own country. Turkey comes 118th, United Arab Emirates 119th, Egypt 120th, Morocco 121st, Iran 123rd, Bahrain, Oman, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, it goes on. So these are some of the last countries in terms of participation and equality for women. And it is also very common to see the reactions and attitudes towards such statistics as blaming the other. Again, a forthcoming writing from the region that is from my country, but has a great influential word for the region, said once, and I will be reading this as a quote, "If the dictatorships, monarchs, sheikhs in the Middle East, Iraq, elsewhere, fall, the direction of petrol's flow will also change. The income of petrol and natural resources will start pouring towards people who are in poverty. With democracy and freedoms, the level of equality in income distribution will also rise up. Social justice will come. And this is exactly, brothers, what the giant petroleum firms, banks, private sector, multinationals do not want happen. That is why we don't have democracy in our countries. Now, the dictators are fallen. With this, do we think the nightmare of cultural inequalities will also end? Let's take a mini journey towards the latest political turmoil now, so-called Arab Spring, which has been followed with great applause and admiration across the world. Are the unexpected developments in the Middle East really going so well that is hard to believe? If so, why our instincts are telling us something different, and why women, minority ethnicities of the region are rather in a restless wait? Then why the worries have become more dense in this perfect spring environment? Because the reality is much stronger and effective than the magical illusions. In Tunisia, the moderate Islamists are coming to power. However, even at the first steps, with their first election, the EU election observers had to issue a statement with their concerns on the delay of the count of the votes. Despite the lack of official results, announcements were being made on the victory, which is controversial for a democracy and transparency. And right after the elections, those who have been injured, disabled during the struggle through the revolution went on hunger strike because they did not receive any care or support after the fall of Ben Ali. In Egypt, no doubt that the Muslim Brothers have the most dynamic organization. However, according to latest public surveys of summer 2011 in Egypt, ordinary citizens express that they feel less secure on the streets and are much more poor now compared to Mubarak regime. Those that have expressed feeling they lead vital threat have doubled since Mubarak regime for the time being. And yet, those that have said that they are able to provide livelihood for their household are only 1/3 of the society currently, whereas this was half of the population before. In Libya, the question of Islamists remains a question mark. While Sharia has been officially declared, Libyan people feel threatened to get out of their house after 5 p.m. now. There's a curfew every day. This has clarified for those who wishes to live differently, believe or not believe at all, that from now on, belief and lifestyle system is now under state control. And why am I interested in this political thunder? Because I believe that womankind's role in this movement is only limited to the role of a secondary gender, who is in obedience, who is supposed to be and expected to be in obedience with the rules of the religion. And in this movement, disabled woman does not even exist. In these cultures, no doubt that disabled woman is discriminated much more than any other for being woman, for being disabled woman. Here, let me share with you the story of Sitare, just to illustrate a disabled woman's story from the region, and it dates back to time that I lived in and worked in Iran. I had just started actually my humanitarian mission in Iran when I was called by the guard of our Tehran-based office to meet a couple of Afghan refugees waiting in the medical unit. When I went downstairs to the medical unit, I saw a young woman looking at me with her eyes filled with pain. In her tradition, she did not speak, but her male relatives spoke for her. What they asked for was basically a female doctor to examine Stare because she had some trouble with her internal organs. We did find a female doctor, and her long treatment process started. And through that process, I met her quite frequently, and Stare started slowly speaking. Her story came out in bits and pieces, and I put them all together. She was born without limbs and was married off to an elderly man as his third wife when she was only 13 years old. She was the same age as me when we met. I was 26 then, though she had grown hundreds of years older by being a child bride of the dark geography she lived in, being locked up in a dark room for many years until we met, actually, where she was used only as a sex object. And this was perceived as a right thing to do in the environment she was born into. It was perceived that her so-called dysfunctional body had to have a function. Her disability meant she did not have any value as a human being, having feelings, despair. Despite all, though, she had survived, escaped a conflict in her hometown with her family, became a refugee in Iran at a very young age, resisted the destiny imposed on her, and believed in the existence of another, more hopeful future awaiting her. Her silence and forbearance, later on I discovered, were the keys to her survival. Her invisibility was her protection. I got attached to her with admiration. We overcome and certain things, we found ways to protect her, and Stare is now back in her homeland, where peace, social freedoms, and human rights are on a cutting edge in a fragile state. Stare is also with fitted limbs now, and she's telling other girls in Afghanistan the possibility of another life other than being a child bride. Sitare's journey is one of my most important inspirations for sure, but it's also when I started realizing this, the most vulnerable layer of the society all across the world, women with disabilities and girls with disabilities. While there is certainly no hierarchy in human rights, and there should not be, but this is certainly an area that deserves much more attention as a human rights area. As in Stare's story, all researchers in the world show us that closed societies discriminate against disabled persons much more. If we consider that, in general, the closedness of a society is measured by looking at the status of women, then we can easily see that the first job is to fight against any gender disability-based discrimination, is actually to spread the notion, the idea of freedoms and openness. There can only be a freedom-based revolution for all, in equal sense, in a society when that society embraces the idea of freedom and its true meaning and its common sense and mentality. Otherwise, freedom revolution will mean that the problematic system will remain the same, but only its lords will change. Think of Iran as a tray of rice, was said by a taxi driver, Azeri taxi driver, when the question was posed to him, what is the difference, the social change and the difference between the Shah period and later on the Mullah period? And he said, think of Iran as a tray of rice. Shah used to eat it with manners, with his fork, and whatever the grains fell down, we used to collect them and eat it. But mullahs are eating it with spoons, and nothing is falling down to us. So we're hungry. Those amongst you with strong memory would remember that the revolution in Iran was in fact a leftist freedom revolution when it happened, and yet the results of it is being watched with great worry. Why? I don't think there is any other words needed here. On my part, it was to my big surprise that, leaving aside disabled women, I have not seen disabled people on the streets of Iran, wherever I went, Mashhad, Urumiyeh, Isfahan, Tehran, you name it, during my 2.5 years' time life there. And I kept thinking, this is despite being in a country which saw a horrendous war for about 10 years and lost about 1 million people. In humanitarian work, we do calculate the numbers of disabled and those injured by multiplying those casualties by 4. So this should have, only on its own, this war, at its minimum, should have produced 4 million people disabled, whereas Iran still is trying to clean the landmines that is left behind from that war. So I always imagined that there should be people, limbless people, disabled people. I did not see them, leave aside the disabled woman. Perhaps the odd one, but that wasn't, the streets were not there, were not full. Again, I discovered through my observations that while martyrs had their special place, martyrs of that war, on the walls and streets of Iran, being praised as the heroes of that war, those disabled and injured by that war were hidden away behind the doors, behind the walls, and as if they brought shame to the household. So while I knew by heart that there were all these disabled people out there, my own experiences also showed that they were very much hidden away. Here, I believe, telling you one of my many and daily stories will summarize it all. One of my stories at airport security, and my leg had a great match in Iran. It was always perceived as a great threat to the Iranian national security. And sometimes I was stripped and kept, naked in a borderline security spot until they gave me my leg back. Sometimes they gave it back in pieces. And after a couple of times that we had to remake my leg outside Iran, of course, I promised my mom not to give it away again to the security man who asked for it, to examine it. So, and then with this promise in mind, I was once traveling through Iraqi border back to Bushehr, where the uranium enrichment program is taking place. So, and the driver dropped me off to the airport for me to fly back from Bushehr to Tehran. And I said, calm down, you're not gonna give your leg this time, you promised your mom. And so I passed through the first booth that is reserved for women, and you go through the full check. And there I kept my, I composed myself and I kept calm, and I tried to, have a common point, something, make a joke, and I got out of it. The second booth, I raised my voice a little bit, I got out of it. But the third booth, there was no way, no reasoning with these female security members, and then they went to the male booth and they asked for a gunned Basij police to actually come and confiscate my leg. So, because I did not surrender it. So he came with his gun and he took away my passport, and he said, until you give me your leg, you'll just get disappeared here, and nobody can find you again. So I was just at the last point, and my promise to my mom and my leg, giving it away. Again, they will put it into pieces, all these practical and non-practical, irrational, rational things through my mind, and suddenly I lost it. That's another great thing we have as Turks, and I lost it. I lost it, and then I actually just forgot where I am, and I took away my chador, the cover that I used to wear, and I threw it, and I pulled down my pants, and I showed my leg to the security, and I said, you want to see my leg? Here is my leg. And suddenly, I realized that we are in the Islamic Republic of Iran, and I actually pulled down my pants and showing my leg. And later on, this has become a great story, but I thought I was PNG'd that moment, persona non grata. No, I mean, I was in appropriate clothing and everything, so don't imagine that I was stripping there. But still, so with the reaction that I saw in his face, I suddenly realized all these things, where I am and what I did. And so he started running the other direction through my passport. With that, he kept saying, devil woman, devil woman, devil woman. So, but through... Oh yeah, no, thanks for that, and I'll share that with you later in the reception. Or if there's an edit for the video, perhaps. But this may be a bit promotional item in the middle. So yes, I promise in the reception I'll share that with you. But anyway, so this devil woman story kept on repeating in my life while I had to travel a lot in Iran. But it also showed me that it was not only that, I mean, two things actually, that all these disabled people were, it definitely was a proof that security people were not familiar with what a prosthetic leg was. And that also showed me that in a country where, at least from that war, there are 4 million people limbless or with different disabilities are not out there and they are not familiar with it. But second, and most important, is that they were not at all used to a disabled woman actively working and out there in public life. So this was another barrier that I kept hitting and hitting and hitting, and finally I understood. I'm a bit slow in that sense. I get it less speedy than I act. So, yeah. And usually I have my friends from these regions, including my country, telling me after their visits to the US, Europe, Scandinavia, that somehow there are so many disabled people in these places, in these countries. And they wonder, you know, what is the root cause? We don't have so many disabled people. Why there are so many in the US and Europe? I've heard this question so many times, trust me. I try to explain that it's not because American society has more disabilities than us, but it is much more integrated in the society. They are much more integrated. There is accessibility, and more than anything, there is the public attitudes that is not stopping or blocking them from integrating to life, public life or political life. Here, just like we mix up things, I think the West may be putting the Libyan uprising, the execution of Gaddafi, elections of Tunisia and its Jasmine Revolution, the protests at Tahrir Square in the same place as the execution of Ceausescu in Romania or the fall of Berlin Wall. However, we from the region, we cannot afford to do this. Middle East and North Africa is not Eastern or Central Europe. Wishing for democracy does not necessarily mean that you have the cultural codes that can make a democracy function. Democracy is a result of a big political oppression, and Soviet regime, the fall of it, has shown that to us. However, in the Middle East, and this is an argument to discuss for all of us, I think the pressures are not only political, but religious. Therefore, I suspect how much democracy is wanted by the Arab Spring/Autumn, said by some women from the region, which is openly full of religious references and drive, and does not inspire confidence regarding its true desire. The Middle East is not necessarily very keen on a life with differences. Neither its women, even more so disabled women. Although many knows this reality, it has been a gameplay to pretend if it is not as such due to security reasons, other concerns. Now again, dreams that a summer will follow these springs are being polished. But this is not necessarily the truth from the eyes of an ordinary woman in the region. Recently, I was with a group of women from various spring countries, and each and every of them has expressed the same thing, that they are sick, tired of hearing the word spring, while they are very worried now on how worse their status and rights can get as a result of this. In the meantime, Turkey model is shown as a model by the West constantly as a democracy. Western intellectuals think about Turkey's moderate Islamist government that is building a democracy in the country. The argument behind it is the transition from a militaristic power-centered system to a more civilian-based system that is supposed to be more of a democracy, more freedoms to the public. When you look at it this way, this analysis cannot be criticized. However, when you look at the reality on the ground, yes, militaristic structure has been transformed to a more successful technology-backed up system, civilian system, but it is rather moving towards a police democracy. This time, as the culture of land mines of militaristic system did not really get reformed. And the same approach seems to be used by the ruling authorities right now, just like the military coup time. You understand this more and more when you look at the basic musts of a democracy. They seem to be not getting there, but rather on a decline. Let's look at a must for a democracy. That is the very basic one, freedom of expression. I guess we can all agree that in a democracy, the most important thing is to be able to ask a question. without feeling threatened, or the possibility of persecution. So I really sometimes wonder, do we really think that people will now be able to ask a question in Turkey or in the region where revolutions for democracy took place? Or is it an illusion of democracy that we are living in? In Turkey, since last year, there are more journalists imprisoned than Iran and China, 63 of them. Freedom of expression is getting much more problematic. Quoting a government supporter writer on the recent arrests of Nedim Şener, Ahmet Şık, who has actually been arrested for a book unpublished as a first. Ragıp Zarakolu, a publisher, Büşra Ersanlı, a professor, who have been participants of a political academy, a peaceful thing. He says, sometimes a book can be as dangerous as political science academy. The moderate Islamists of Turkey wants to play the democracy game by the rules, yes, but asks for specific exceptions on certain areas like freedom of speech. While we are talking about democracy in Turkey, we are avoiding to talk about the controlling impact of belief on the society. All revolutions are bloody, and the new elite is brutal towards the old. But there is a lot of meaning on what is happening in Turkey, because it crosses its borderlines. It plays and can play a big role for the regional movement that is happening in the Arab Peninsula, pending which direction it develops into. As in Turkey, AKP came to power with democracy and not by gun militants. That is why it's very important which direction it goes to, and we have to make sure that it goes to a positive direction. Despite this fact, I wonder why a more humane and universal value-based society is not being built out of this. Sometimes I do worry that it is going the other direction. And I do wonder why a government which has won a crushing victory with a 50% vote and a booming economy in this environment in the world becoming much more oppressive, while it is supposed to be much more relaxed and uplifted for such a victory and try to be much more human rights-based to lead the region that it wants to lead. The information-based society structure that had not yet settled down is rapidly leaving its place to a belief-based society. Very recently, the National Science Institute's autonomous status has been changed by a bylaw passed by the recent parliamentary term by the government. Now it has become a state-driven institution, losing its credibility as an independent scientific institution where a majority of the scientists and its head will be appointed by the government. I wonder if this institute will ever be able to use or refer to Darwinism theory as it did in the past. Here, is Turkey affecting leading Arab Spring, or is it being affected and taken Algeria as a model for itself, is a question mark in my mind. If our theory was that the societies gets more conservative and fanatic due to the lack of education and welfare, then this should have been an exception that proves the rule, and our society should be freed of all these elements that I'm talking about. We should have been able to ask questions more. Worsening state of freedom of expression is not that. Is not a proof for that. Moving away from information-based society to a more state-controlled belief society is neither a proof for that. So there, just as a case study to conclude, I would like to look at violence against women that the technology prevented me to show you a newspaper, one page of a newspaper actually. According to state statistics, violence against women, killings of women actually for honor, have multiplied 14 times in the past 7 years. This is not my statistics, it is state statistics. And Family Affairs Minister has also come up with it. So why the day-to-day violence is increasing each day? I would like to share an experience with you as a victim of violence myself. While I was working on a project on violence against women with Swedish journalists, we were looking at media's perception and media's reflection and projection of violence against women in Turkey. I had this group of Swedish journalists visiting. And the first day I opened the third page, which I was going to show you actually, just like that. This is the third page. There's 8 news about violence against women, 3 of them being honor killing, 1 of them about a higher court decision that has been taken last week, which I will tell you about. And 1 is a woman whose mother was killed by her father and who is now trying to get away from her own husband, not to share the same destiny with her mother, and asking for a shelter. This is the third page of a newspaper. So I was talking about this with the Swedish journalists back in 2003, and that evening we went out for a dinner. And when we finished our dinner and were walking towards our hotel, through the small streets of Beyoğlu, Taksim, there was a parking gang, and some of them were driving very fast, and they ran over a guest of mine, a Swedish guest of mine, on the foot of her. So I said, "What are you doing?" And at that moment, that gang of men, 1 being the lead, has beaten me up on the street. And then my prosthetic leg even got broken with that. Up to now, everything is normal. This can happen in any country. After this point, the police, who was very difficult to get the attention of, and the judge later on, as this has become a public case, asked the same question. What were you doing on the street as a handicapped woman at that hour? So this was repeatedly asked to me by law representatives, by security representatives. However, a year later, I dropped the case. I said, I can't deal with this. And a year later, in a country where I just moved into in my international work, the door got knocked by 4 men with cases. And my mom was, as usual, she was settling my life in my new country. She opened the door, I was at work, and then she said, welcome to these men who were with mustache, who were clearly Turkish, and then they said, well, we would like to settle this peacefully. She said, what? Well, we would like to give you all of this, and these cases apparently ended up, it was basically money inside the bribe. And they said, we would like only in return of this, and even more if you wish, we would like Safak to actually publicly come out and forgive our brother. Because the streets and the other parking gangs did not allow him to do business anymore because he has beaten a disabled woman. So what the law, justice system, and the security forces did not do, the society's values did. They isolated him, they punished him for a year. He was not able to get out on the street, neither do business, and he needed my apology before the public to be able to live life again. I did not give it. Only in the month of January this year, 17 women have been the victim of honor killing. According to the statistics of Justice Ministry, the number of honor killings have increased from 66 killings a year in the year of 2002 to 1,126 women in 2009, only being killed for honor. And there, a story for you, what is an honor killing? For instance, a young woman in Ağrı, orders a love song on the radio, and the brother hears about it while listening to the radio program, and the mother orders, as she shamed the household, she gets killed the next day for honor, for ordering a love song. But there is something troubling here, because with the EU accession process since 2003, the legislation in Turkey to fight against violence against women had been perfected We have great laws now, and it gets applied and implemented at European standards, if you wish. It may be one of the most heaviest criminal law applied to cases of violence against women. So we should ask here why violence against women is on a rapid increase while the law is being perfected and being applied. So I think we should, as a conclusion, I think we should work much more on bringing that law matching with the societal values. There is something unmatching there, and in my next journey in this parliamentary term, I would like to look at that rather than producing more laws. Because if society's values is not matching with law, and law is there just for the showcase, then it is no use to make more laws in that country. So that is one of the, and so far, violence against women by the government has been tried to be solved as teaching women their rights and behave more appropriately according to Turkish society's values. I don't know what it is, but I think we need to also work on perpetrators, not just women themselves, and teaching them their rights. So let's get to the holy quotas for women's participation in politics as the final. An interesting comparison would be that in 2010, Afghan parliament had 17% women representation, while American Congress had 14%. So ironic, but those quota seats imposed by the Western cultural values or the women's movement, it remains on the surface while those parliamentarians cannot necessarily and freely participate. But just like my Qatari friend or my Libyan friend, have to remain silent and obedient just to fill in a quota, fearing for their life for each time they enter the parliament. Because if it is not backed up by cultural acceptance, then it doesn't work. Any quota, any legislation, any law. So, to conclude, I think Turkey will play and is playing a big role in the whole regional change that is happening. But if we can only make this law meet with society's values and find a way for that, then I think it can play a very positive role. Thank you.
We started a little bit late, but I suggest we go on until 7:30 because we'll have a few minutes to have some informal conversations after 7:30. So we've got about half an hour for Q&A. If you raise your hand, Safak will recognize you and she'll direct traffic herself. I'll only interfere if you start monopolizing the conversation. Otherwise, we can have a one-on-one dialogue between Safak and the questioner. Okay? So if you want to raise your hand, we'll get started.
Just a very brief comment and then a question. Comment is thank you for, in the parliament, showing the masculine fantasies when they told you you cannot wear pants. And you said, you want a leg, here's the leg. That was a great part. I really liked it. Thank you for that. And my question is the connection between feminism and disability. It kind of falls under the realm of politics of difference. Men, women, disability, undisabled. But at the same time, I think it's interesting to look how the discourse of disability works as a liberal discourse in terms of equality. And I think it's really important in terms of pregnancy, for example, and work rights. There is an interesting debate in the feminist discourse in terms of people who are trying to frame pregnancy as a kind of disability. So it's precisely for that reason we will treat it because we are all human beings and we can all be disabled. I cannot be women, but we can all be disabled. So let's let's frame pregnancy in terms of disability and let's treat it that way. So you can just be away for 2 weeks, let's say. And then you're less disabled because giving birth is it's not a real disability, you recover from it. So, the disability can be a politics of difference kind of discourse, but at the same time it can be a quite liberal discourse. So, and in terms of pregnancy, I've been observing in Turkey lately that, women are working less. I've been observing, so, and if you ask for your right to work and let's say I want 6 months of pay because pregnancy is not a disability, it's something positive, that I give birth to something. then disability kind of actually like it's not no longer working as a liberal equalizing thing. So I think there's also that aspect of how it's been utilized. So what do you think about that?
Well, let me get to pregnancy. I think we're in the second week now that the world has become 7 billion. So first of all, I don't think we need any more pregnancies in the world. I know it's a very controversial thing to say, but I don't think we dealt with it so well in all over the human history. So if you ask me, I mean, using pregnancy argument as a disability, attached to disability, it only happens when women's rights are very much violated, and that is the only way to get to find a right space for you, rights space. So I think that may be the root cause of it. And in societies, again, the closed societies and not right space societies, these kind of mix-ups and talking through symbols and using symbols for achieving more rights, unfortunately, is the case. For the pants, that was something very surprising for me as well. I've never in my life imagined that a part of my body and me, my leg, would be a discussion topic before a parliamentarians group, openly, without my involvement in it. So, and I never imagined again that my parliamentary career, I mean, I don't see it, I'm not a career politician, I'm a perhaps more conviction politician. I try to call myself more like active citizen rather than politician. But I never imagined myself giving 2 press conferences on the issue of pants, skirts, and a prosthetic leg, whereas I have no expertise on these issues. I am not a tailor. I don't make prosthetic legs, and I had to talk about it. And I did hold press conferences as a spokesperson working for the UN, but I never had this kind of press conferences before in my life. So I was shocked as much as you were. But this is because we talk everything through symbols. I do understand it as well. But I think it's time to become more open society and to talk about real issues that is below it. I mean, so rather than using my poor leg and me for bigger issues bigger than me, is not the case. But I was always, I'm all for freedoms, but let's talk really openly about everything. That is a better way, perhaps. And I don't want to give any more press conferences on legs and skirts and pants. Sorry, this is maybe for those who don't know the issue. I'll send you a link later on that to explain the whole thing. There is a dress code backdated to the establishment of Turkish Parliament in 1923, and that dress code says that is only applied within the General Assembly, the hall where the MPs are, not the rest of the Parliament's building. But just in that hall, women MPs are supposed to dress in 2-piece with skirts. So I can actually wear a pants and put a skirt on it, because that's also 2-piece. So if you look from the legal interpretation, I mean, you can play with the interpretation a lot. And I was really, motivated by doing different creative things, but right now I stick by the rules because we are the lawmakers. We cannot make a gap in it. But so this is what it is. And as I entered to the Parliament, my first day, and I had a photo of it actually, as I am. So I enter with my great friend Sezgin Tanrıkulu, who is a human rights defender, used to be the head of Diyarbakır Bar, for Bar Association for Lawyers. And so we enter, he's carrying my bag. I'm more worried that we will be photographed with him carrying a female bag than myself becoming an issue that day. So we enter, General Assembly is passed, and then I get out, and all over the media, I am there, and they're coming to me, Safak, what are you doing? So my prosthetic, the first reaction by the government, to change this code, which was a demand by the female MPs, very rightly so, before as well, that from different various parties, there has been demands that has been put before the Parliamentary Rule Committee, Constitutional Committee as well, that they want to wear pants, trousers. But this did not happen because of insensitivities of the headscarf issue, this issue, that issue. So it has been received very complex. So when I was there with my prosthetic leg out in the open, it was great excuse. So let's get this first female member of the parliament who is disabled with a prosthetic leg. Oh, pity her. Let's bring it. Let's revise this rule and let her wear a pants. So this was basically me being the subject model of the whole change, and I kept repeating that in every work that I've undertaken. Only places that I felt the need to cover my leg is actually those post-conflict areas. For instance, Lebanon, when we were doing demining. Every other person is limbless because of mines, because of cluster bombs. And there, they cannot afford to get a leg, leave it aside, any other medical attention. So apart from those places, Haiti earthquake, then I wear pants. But, you know, the rest of the time, I wear whatever I want. So, so this was the first time, and a kind of a shocking thing. But I wish, you know, these kind of freedoms are introduced, of course, but me and my prosthetic leg being part of the whole discussion without my consent or knowledge was, of course, a bit of a shock. So this was, in summary, this was the thing, but it went on for 4 months. So any other questions? Yes, please. Yes, there is. It takes all across the world. The attitudinal barriers are much more than the physical barriers that persons with disabilities hit onto every day. So I think working on the attitudinal, behavioral, and societal values on it, taking it away from a charity-based look, somebody to pity for kind of look, to a social right and human rights model approach will be very helpful. It will require a lot of work, but if we provide, I always believe that let's go micro. If we provide a little good practice, a best practice, and shine it, then it will be followed. That I have seen, and yesterday in our little talk, I also shared, and we had this exchange. We did this in humanitarian work as well. It's a useful, successful model. Take it from one place and take it from Pakistan bombing of the building, where Twitter was a fantastic social media tool, where we had saved lots of people thanks to it. Because there was a great Twitter queen from her penthouse. She was a very wealthy woman. She was just spending a lot of time on tweeting. And her penthouse was just across this building that was bombed. And people were taken hostage. So she started, reporting on it, where terrorists went, where, people were jumping out of windows. And this became a very big humanitarian tool later on for us when Haiti earthquake happened, and people started using that, and MIT had a paper on it. So sharing these kind of best practices on any kind of pilot work, on changing attitudes on disability, I think, yes, society's values and attitudes is the biggest barrier in that. Yes, there are so many legislations that are not in harmony with the Disability Act, the law that has been introduced in 2005. More than anything, in Turkey we do have a quota system. Again, for female quota, there is also the disability quota, 10%, according to the population, proportion to population. But that quota is, more than anyone, is being not used by the state institutions, by the public institutions. Halkbank, that is a state-owned bank, has preferred to pay fine instead of employing people with disabilities in its 10% quota 7 years in a row now. So 7 years in a row, they prefer to pay fine rather than employing persons with disabilities. And when it is in Justice Ministry, and this is a human rights issue for me, Justice Ministry, there is a quota of, let me quote, maybe the number is so and so, right? 1,800 persons can be employed under this quota, persons with disabilities, experts with disabilities, and only one has been employed so far. So under the quota, under Justice Ministry. So, I mean, this is really attitudinal, and this is really societal barrier. We have to overcome this and build confidence. And those that are employed, I have a friend who has PhD in finance, a great mind, fantastic, dynamic. He has polio since childhood, and he has found work in finance ministry as a T-boy. So, so when you are also employing, you are not, respecting that person's qualifications, but just filling a quota on the surface. Just as we were talking about the female quota being filled on the surface, but those female members of the political space or other places are not in a place to participate, really. So unless we change and we work on the societal values, all those symbolic things do not make sense somehow. Yes, it is a good thing to put as a target, but we have to work a lot to fill it with the reality. Is that, yeah? May I receive a question?
For your speech. I certainly agree with your concerns and thoughts about Turkey being a role model for the democratization process in the Middle East. Not only because freedom of expression is curtailed, but also freedom of association is also severely curtailed in Turkey in the last months, considering the 3,000 members of the legal Kurdish political party, BDP, let alone students and other environmental actors. But then I also wonder, whether you are too dismal about the prospects of Arab Spring, in the sense that, these movements were like experiences of popular mobilization and grassroots mobilization, unlike the democratization that has been happening in Turkey, which was electorally based and led by a new political elite, so to say. So in that sense, the grassroots and popular mobilization create a public imaginary which the people can draw upon when new elites curtail their rights. So in that sense, this grassroots mobilization has created a history to draw upon. And we know from Turkey that in the case of the Kurdish political movement, despite all authoritarian measures against them, once that mobilization starts, that grassroots movement create a public imaginary and struggle for rights continue on. So I feel like there is much more prospect for Arab Spring when we take into account that people actually not only use institutionalized means but also use extra institutional grassroots means. So I was wondering what you think about that.
Well, you're right. I mean, it's very difficult to discuss the whole movement in the Arab Spring in this short perspective. It was only one perspective that I wanted to present. So you're right, and I do agree that is far too narrow, and the grassroots involvement will be much larger later on at a later stage. But that, I think, we cannot squeeze into one talk and one. So that is what I think right now. I'm very happy to discuss it later at a more extended exchange. Any other questions or silence?
I'll shoot the last one then.
Sure.
Could you say a few things maybe about your UN experience? Because clearly you've been at the UN for 7 or 8 years working on rights for disabled people. Are there particular policies that you think have worked reasonably well in moving the agenda forward? Certain things have been accomplished to really address the attitudinal issue. Are there certain things that you say, well, here we've made some progress and we've chosen good policies to push that agenda along?
Yeah. Well, in the UN, we actually has been working on, I mean, we've been working and the NGOs have been pushing for it. And there was a momentum. In 2006, the UN came out with a new human rights convention on the rights of persons with disabilities, which has been very much with the involvement, contrary to other human rights conventions that has been more expertise written by experts and committees and all that. This has been really the NGO's success. It was very grassroots, upwards made convention. So that has been very much achieved, and now it has been a record-breaking number of signatory states, as well as ratifications. It has reached now, I think, 112 ratifications. In only 4 years' time, 2006 and then 2007 entry into force, in about 4 years' time, and reached about 190 signatory states. So it shows how much need there was and how much push from the grassroots was there in the dynamics of different all across the world, different countries. That is one that is achieved. And along with that, in parallel to that, we worked on the implementation of the convention, not only in all through UN family operations, be it UNICEF, UNDP, harmonizing it with the convention's principles, mainstreaming disability in every UN program, but also internal policies of actually employment policies, retention policies for those UN staff, or recruitment policy for equal opportunities for as much as gender equality, disability. Candidates with disabilities are now much more welcomed, and things are being made accessible in the UN system. With the UN, there is one thing that was very problematic, and through a working group, my team and I, we worked a lot on that, and we have achieved one of the victories that I can definitely be very loud and proud. May seem small, but very important to me, is the internal work policy, human resources policy, that we discovered that working for the UN, you actually you are exposed to a lot of difficult situations, especially in the humanitarian work. You work in post-conflict areas, in borderlines, and most of our colleagues had hidden or visible disabilities due to their work, resulted at a duty line. And the attitude in the UN up to 3 years ago, until we came with this policy where we had everyone's consensus, but it took a lot of work, lobbying, across, horizontally, vertically, all over, going very high up and to the bottom as well as everywhere, basically. And it took about 2 years of lobbying and working and getting the consensus. But the attitude until then was to put all these UN staff who has been disabled in some way on a fat UN pension and not reintegrate them into work again. But after that policy, there is now great integration policy that has been introduced. and all those UN staff that has been some way disabled on the line of duty are being reintegrated rather than being put on a pension and just isolated out of work. So that is, I think, it was a revolution in an old UN system. Thank you.
I think we've had a very educational but also a very inspirational story. So thank you again for coming. I think we'll have a few minutes for some informal conversation after this talk. So please join me again and thank you for a great conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.